When the body of a young woman is discovered in an Illinois cornfield, it takes decades for her to be identified. The investigation continues into the present as investigators seek out the person, likely a serial killer, responsible for her death in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
A quick heads up. This episode contains discussion of sexually motivated homicide. Please listen with care. Eulalia Chavez, who preferred to go by Leah and was often called Lolly by family, was last seen alive in September of 1986. She was 27 years old at the time, and it had been a while since she'd had a fixed address. Not one to linger long in one place, she lived on the road, crisscrossing the U.S., possibly, according to the FBI, as she followed a band. Leah had been traveling like that, carrying her belongings in a large hiker's backpack for years, ever since she'd left her home in Palo Alto a decade beforehand when she'd been in her late teens. As a child in Palo Alto, she'd lived with her adoptive parents, Maurice and Sonia Wilkemer, who had adopted her along with her biological sister from Costa Rica when Leah had been 2.5 years old.
Okay.
The girls' adoptive mom, Sonia, had been a professional photographer, and their adoptive dad, Maurice, had been a U.S. Foreign Service employee, which was what had brought the Wilkemer family to Panama, where they'd been living when they'd adopted the girls. Later, they returned to the U.S., settling with their adopted daughters and their biological son in Palo Alto, California. Leah was an artistic child with a creative side that was often on display. She enjoyed drawing, making her own jewelry, and even her own clothing, anything that allowed her creativity to shine through. When she was about 13 years old, her adoptive dad, Maurice, died, leaving her adoptive mom, Sonia, to raise the 3 Wilkemer children as a single parent. While we don't know all the details of Leah's teen years, we know that they weren't easy. She ran away numerous times and, according to what her adoptive mom told reporters for the Bellevue News-Democrat in 2008, she was sent to juvenile hall several times as well. Many years later, Leah's older brother, Neil, would reflect on their childhood, telling that same newspaper, quote, "There were times when we were happy together, but there were a lot of times where there was a lot of hell," end quote.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. It sounds like her childhood was probably pretty tumultuous. And then, in her late teens, by which time she was no longer living at home, Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl of her own. According to reporting for that newspaper, after giving birth as a teen, Leah cared for her infant daughter, Katie, for several months. During that time, they lived in an apartment, possibly with the baby's father, about whom very little is known. When Katie was between 4 and 6 months old, Leah placed her for adoption. And after that, the details of Leah's life, her location, how she spent her time, and who she spent it with, are pretty hazy. There was no effort to search for Leah after she disappeared, and a decade would pass before she garnered the attention of law enforcement. Even then, it would only be as a Jane Doe. It wouldn't be until years after she was finally identified that her daughter, Katie, would learn her identity and of her tragic fate. After learning these things, that her first mom had died violently at a young age and that she'd spent almost as many years as a Jane Doe as she'd spent alive, Katie would go on to find out as much about her mom as she could from the friends and family members who remembered her. One of the things she learned, according to a 2008 article published in the Bellevue News-Democrat, is that although her family had called her Lolly, she had preferred to go by Leah. On that note, most reporting on her case uses the nickname Lolly. However, out of respect for her preferences, I'll be continuing to call her by her preferred nickname throughout this episode. Please know that most of the sources I used to research this episode refer to her by Lolly, and if you want to read up on her case, you'd be best off using the names Eulalia or Lolly to search for articles. With that being said, for many years, Leah was known not by her given name or any nickname, but simply as Jane Doe. On September 6, 1986, a Summerfield, Illinois farmer stumbled upon her remains in one of his cornfields. The village of Summerfield was rural, home to just a few hundred people. and Leah's killer, whoever they were, had chosen it as a place to abandon her remains. The state of her body, when discovered, told a brutal story. It had been intentionally and crudely positioned to shock whoever found it. The farmer who'd stumbled upon it contacted local authorities right away. When investigators arrived, they found the nude, cruelly mutilated body of a petite young woman. It was apparent that she'd died recently, and a medical examiner would determine that she'd died less than 24 hours before being found. It was also obvious that her manner of death had been homicide, and the medical examiner would determine that her method of death had been strangulation. Whoever had killed her had used a piece of clothing to strangle her and had left it at the scene. Although her body had been left unclothed, her belongings, such as a bag containing clothing, had been abandoned alongside her. There were also other non-clothing items at the scene, a matchbook from the Illinois State Fair and fishing line, for example. One police officer even noted there being a set of silverware and a salt and pepper shaker at the scene. I imagine that those may have belonged to Leah and that she may have carried them with her when she traveled. The personal belongings, unfortunately, did not include any form of ID, and the medical examiner wasn't able to determine the identity of the Jane Doe. Investigators noted that the clothing found with the victim was unique, no surprise considering that Leah was known to make her own, and that the victim had had extensive dental work done. So at first, they were optimistic that she would be identified relatively quickly. However, that turned out not to be the case. Ultimately, she was interred in a local cemetery, and her grave marker was inlaid with the inscription, "Jane Doe, known only to God." The community of Summerfield, home to just a few hundred people, became ingrained with Leah's identity. For years, she was referred to as the Summerfield Jane Doe. Local investigators had sketches made in hopes that someone would recognize her, but the effectiveness of the sketches was hindered by a data entry error made early in the investigation. In 1986, when Leah's remains were discovered, she was, of course, fingerprinted, and according to reporting for the Bellevue News-Democrat, when her prints were entered into a computer, a designated age range of 18 to 25 was also entered in reference to her age. And when investigators reached out to the FBI to request a cross-comparison of fingerprints, they specifically asked that Leah's prints be checked against the prints of women who would have been between the ages of 18 to 25 at the time.
Okay, so I'm guessing that's where the error comes into play.
Yeah, that was an estimated age range, but it wasn't quite right. And the specificity of this request was unfortunate because Leah had been just a little bit outside of that age range. She'd been 27 years old when she died. And those couple of years ended up delaying her identification by decades.
So I kind of see both sides of that. Like, you want to get the most optimal search parameters because then that would expedite the request rather than searching it versus everyone in the entire FBI database at that time.
Right. Good luck ever getting through that.
Yeah. So I understand why they would specify it, but at the same time, by being wrong just by that few years, you're going to completely miss it if it is in there.
Right. And that's exactly what happened. So one piece of reporting that I read mentions basically the same context you just brought up. It says that identifying a victim based off of their prints was really tedious work back then, since computerized systems like we have now were relatively few and far in between, and prints had to be compared by hand. So that's likely the reason why such a specific request was made. The request at the time represented an enormous amount of work, even just checking 18 to 25.
Yeah, that's a monumental task in and of itself. Now, unfortunately, that means that that monumental task was done to no avail and just ultimately a waste of time because she wasn't in that age range.
Plus, while the thought of comparing prints by hand is overwhelming on any scale, really, when we consider that Leah wasn't from anywhere near the area where she was found, and that her prints, if they were on file at all, might have been one of millions and millions of sets of prints located in physical repositories anywhere around the country, well, it's not surprising that she wasn't identified until technology advanced. More advanced investigative technology was applied to her case in 2008. By that point in time, despite the passage of more than 20 years since the discovery of her remains, Illinois investigators had not forgotten about her case. Her unsolved murder had lingered in their consciousness, just like her headstone lingered in that Somerville cemetery, a reminder that she had lain nameless for years and that her loved ones, wherever they were, might not even know she was deceased. In an effort to finally identify her and hopefully to bring her murderer to justice, investigators had her remains exhumed and transported to the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Department. Now, anyone with an interest in forensic science, even if it's just an interest in the classic TV show Forensic Files, has probably heard of that institution before. It's the academic institution that maintains the famed Body Farm in Knoxville.
Yeah, there's a few different programs that have those farms throughout the United States, but I would definitely say they're probably the most famous.
They're definitely the most famous. Illinois investigators transferred Leah's exhumed remains into their custody because they hoped they'd be able to identify her via DNA. However, it turned out that wasn't necessary. Back in Illinois, a forensic scientist employed by the Illinois State Police decided to attempt to identify Leah via her fingerprints. No one had tried to do so since the 80s, and technology had grown in leaps and bounds since then. He took the fingerprints that had been taken back in '86 and put them into AFIS, that's the FBI's digital fingerprint database, and that was all it took. He got a hit. Finally, after more than 21 years, investigators knew that the Summerfield Jane Doe was in fact Eulalia Chavez, who had grown up far away from Summerfield in California. Her prints had been in the system because she'd been arrested on petty larceny charges long ago. While being able to finally identify Leah was a huge breakthrough, it was, of course, only half of the puzzle. Investigators were still driven to figure out who had strangled her and mutilated her body before leaving her to be found in a cornfield. On that note, the way her killer had treated her remains was telling. They had used a knife to mutilate the pelvic area, attempting and failing to remove sexual organs, and had posed the body in a degrading position intended to shock whoever found it, as well as law enforcement. Statistically speaking, these are both highly unusual behaviors present in just a fraction of a percent of murder cases and are often associated with serial sexual homicide. Body posing is often done in order to satisfy some perverse sexual desire of the killer. They may get satisfaction from the idea of shocking investigators and/or whoever discovers the body, and from demeaning the victim. Taking the time to pose the body can be a way of prolonging the pleasure or thrill they experienced while committing the murder. It's also possible, perhaps even likely, that the bodily mutilation was performed after death, although I don't know for sure. In past episodes, we've discussed how when a killer attacks or mutilates a victim's face, it's their way of symbolically destroying what that person's face represents, their personhood. On a similar note, when a killer attacks or mutilates a victim's genital area, it can be their way of symbolically destroying what that area represents, the victim's biological sex and/or sexuality. In other words, in this case, the mutilation the killer subjected Leah's body to may be considered an attack on her identity as a woman. Overall, the picture of motivation painted by the crime scene is crystal clear. Leah's murderer's motivation was clearly sexual. Sexually motivated homicide is unusual in that, unlike most other forms of homicide, it's not uncommon for the offender to be a stranger to the victim. This, of course, can make these cases more difficult to solve than the average homicide, and that's definitely proven to be the case here. More than 30 years have passed since Leah's murder, and the identity of her killer remains unknown. That's not to say that investigators haven't been able to identify some potential suspects, though. They have. More on that next. And now, back to Leah's story. When Leah Chavez's remains were found in an Illinois cornfield, it was abundantly clear that her death had been a sexually motivated murder. And the fact that her murder had been sexually motivated made it very possible, even likely, that her killer had been a stranger to her. Leah was constantly on the road and had been known to hitchhike, so her life had been full of meetings with strangers. Most likely, one of those strangers had turned out to be a depraved predator of women. The likelihood that Leah's killer had been a stranger presented a significant challenge to investigators and, unsurprisingly given the nature of the murder, when they did identify possible suspects, sexually sadistic serial killers took front and center. One such serial killer was Larry Dwayne Hall. He's someone we've discussed before in our episode on the unsolved homicides of Sarah Baim and Catherine Menendez. It's been a couple years since that episode has aired, so to jog your memory, Scott, he's the serial killer who was known to assist his father in digging graves during childhood, and for his obsession with Civil War history and habit of participating in Civil War reenactments as an adult.
Yeah, that sticks out. especially the part about helping his father in the cemetery.
Right. It's kind of a unique backstory. How many child gravediggers do you hear about? So, as we discussed in that episode, Hall was a sexually motivated killer and is known to have sexually assaulted his victims before killing them, often by strangulation. Some of his suspected victims were subjected to mutilation very similar to that seen in Leah's case.
Yeah, I think the inclusion of the sexual mutilation is going to be a big piece because that is not typical of all serial killers.
No, not at all. Not even all sexually motivated serial killers. It's a very rare and disturbing behavior.
Yeah, so I think that the fact that that was included, that narrows down the pool of potential suspects quite a lot.
I agree. So Hall was active during the 80s and the first half of the 90s, and all of his known victims were white or Hispanic females, usually, but not always, in their teens or 20s. So Leah definitely fits that profile. Furthermore, Illinois is one of the 14 states he's believed to have killed in. Additionally, back in 1986, investigators had noted a boot print at the scene where Leah's body had been found, one that they believe likely belonged to her killer. The boot sole had been in a pointed shape that suggested a Western or cowboy-style boot, and the size, a men's 8.5, had been 2 sizes smaller than that worn by the average American male. This suggests that Leah's killer may have been smaller than average in stature, and Hall definitely fits that bill, standing just 5 feet 2 inches, or 157 centimeters tall. On that note, it occurs to me that Hall's small stature might have served as an advantage when it came to approaching potential victims without causing alarm. Leah's decade of surviving life on the road as a young, and small, for that matter, woman suggests that she was likely capable and streetwise. And yet, someone had viciously ended her life, possibly after catching her with her guard down. If you take a look at Hall's mugshots, you'll see that he is not a scary-looking guy. He has what you might call a baby face, albeit covered in a unique facial hairstyle reminiscent of the Civil War era. Combine his soft face and build with a height less than that of the average woman, and it's easy to imagine how he might have been able to approach women without causing the kind of alarm that a larger or rougher-looking guy might have. Scott, I'll show you his mugshot right now so you can see what I mean.
Yeah, the Civil War definitely sticks out. A little garden gnome.
He does kind of have, an overall vibe and physique that's reminiscent of your traditional garden gnome. Yes. Anyway, you would say, if that guy walked up to you on the street, looks relatively non-intimidating, right?
Yeah, he's definitely not intimidating.
So sometimes when we see mugshots of killers or really depraved criminals, they might look a little scary or creepy, and you might think, you know what, if I saw that person coming down the street, I might go the other way. And other times they just look very normal, and he is definitely one of the normal looking guys.
You're using normal very liberally there.
Okay, his facial hair looks pretty goofy. If you're reenacting the Civil War, it's one thing, it might look very natural, but when you're, walking around in jeans and a t-shirt on the street, it looks kind of silly. But other than that, he's an ordinary looking guy. You don't look at him and think, I bet he's a depraved killer.
Yeah, no.
In any case, Hall was first questioned by investigators regarding Leah's murder in 2016. That year, he confessed to her murder while speaking over the phone to an Associated Press journalist. By that point, he was in prison and had been for over a decade. Phone interviews with journalists were one of few points of contact he had with the outside world. According to a couple of articles published in the Bellevue Press-Democrat, Hall had also written a letter to a TV news reporter sometime in 2008 confessing to killing Leah, but I wasn't able to find any further information on that. So, when exactly investigators started looking at Hall as a person of interest, on paper at least, I'm not totally certain, but it was after the 2016 phone confession to a journalist that investigators went to the North Carolina Correctional Facility where Hall was incarcerated to speak with him. However, when they met Hall, he didn't confess to them like he had to the journalist. They spoke for more than 2 hours, during which Hall failed to confess to anything or to say anything particularly meaningful at all. Investigators did note, however, that Hall, who was already serving a life sentence without parole, seemed markedly nervous when speaking to them. And investigators weren't overly worried about the lack of a confession. After all, it's not uncommon for serial offenders to lie, sometimes just for the attention or to cause strife from behind bars. Real answers, they felt, would be more likely to be uncovered via DNA analysis. DNA samples had been collected from numerous items found at the scene in 1986. I would imagine those items probably included the piece of clothing that the killer had used to strangle Leah, although none of the sources I read said for sure. In any case, DNA analysis technology had grown tremendously since 1986. So, in 2016, investigators had the DNA from those items analyzed and compared against Hall's.
I'm just going to step in here and say how refreshing it is, given some of our more recent cases, that the DNA wasn't destroyed from police incompetence. Like, this is a breath of fresh air in some of these unsolved cases when departments don't mishandle evidence and they do preserve it so that it is useful all these years later.
Right, as best I can tell from the research I've done into this case, everything, investigatively speaking, was done appropriately. It looks like local investigators put a lot of care into this case and really were, and still are, determined to solve it. Their enthusiasm does not seem to have wavered over the course of several decades.
I really appreciate that because, like I said, we've covered a few cases here where that was not the case. So it's always good to get that back in alignment.
Yeah, this is not one of those. This is a case where investigators really, it seems like they put their best foot forward. So investigators hoped that the testing might bring closure to Leah's case and to her surviving family members. They did not, however, plan to prosecute Hall for her murder, even if DNA evidence implicated him. This was due to the fact that he was already serving a life sentence without parole and that the death penalty was no longer an option in the state of Illinois, so there was really nothing else they could throw at him.
Yeah, the only thing they really gain is being able to officially close the case.
And that's a big deal in and of itself. Answers would have been of tremendous value, not only because they might provide some sort of closure to Leah's family, but because they would also potentially rule out the possibility that her killer was still roaming free. Unfortunately, the results of the DNA analysis, apparently, were not exactly straightforward. According to reporting for the Bellevue News-Democrat, quote, test results revealed that Hall could not be excluded as contributing to a mixture of DNA, but the answer wasn't positively conclusive either, end quote.
That's really interesting.
It is, and not being a DNA scientist myself, I cannot give you any further details. I can only tell you that's the conclusion that was reached.
Okay.
So, frustratingly, it's still not known whether Hall was telling the truth when he confessed to killing Leah or merely fishing for attention. There are other killings that he's confessed to and then later recanted as well, so this would not be unprecedented behavior. Today, he remains incarcerated, still serving his life sentence at a federal prison in North Carolina. While we're on the subject, though, it is worth mentioning that investigators don't just suspect him of possibly murdering Leah, but also of possibly being responsible for the murder of another woman whose remains were found just 10 miles, or about 16 kilometers, away from where Leah's body had been left in Summerfield.
Okay, so that brings me to a point that I've been thinking about in the back of my head for really most of this case.
Okay.
And that goes back to how her body was positioned to create shock.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that sounds like something that would happen if the person was going to remain in the area, because otherwise, how would you know if you actually did successfully induce that shock?
I can see why you would think that, but to the best of my knowledge, that's probably not the case. For these offenders, just the idea of someone seeing this vulgar and demeaning display, just the idea of that and knowing that it will happen gives them a thrill.
Okay.
That other woman's name is unknown, just as Leah's was for so many years. Also, like Leah, her body was found in an Illinois farm field during the summer. Among the few aware of her case, she's simply known as the Madison County Jane Doe. She was a white female and is believed to have been in her 20s when her murder occurred in 1990, so 4 years after Leah's. Because her and Leah's bodies were found just miles apart, both in farm fields, and because their bodies had been treated in much the same way, their murders are believed to likely have been committed by the same person. The Madison County Jane Doe's killer mutilated her pelvic area, removing sexual organs. This is notable because it's such an incredibly rare behavior, and because Leah's killer had attempted to inflict the same crude procedures upon her remains.
It sounds like her killer got better at being successful with removing those organs.
It does sound that way, yeah.
Or he was interrupted and didn't have time with Leah's case.
Yeah, that's possible. That could have happened. Maybe a vehicle drove by, or maybe it was just more difficult than he had imagined. Now, one difference between their cases, however, is that the Madison County Jane Doe was fatally stabbed, not strangled. Still, it's worth noting that Hall is believed to have fatally stabbed some of his victims and strangled others, so that disparity certainly does not rule him out. It's also worth noting that although the majority of Hall's alleged victims are just that, alleged victims, the case that landed him his life sentence involved him abandoning his victim's body in a farm field. So we know that that was behavior he was known to engage in. Without solid evidence, though, Hall's involvement in Leah's murder and/or the Madison County Jane Doe's murder is only one possibility. Another possibility is that a man named Dale Anderson was responsible for one or both of the murders. Like Hall, Anderson was a serial killer who was active during the 80s. However, for the most part, their similarities end there. Unlike Hall, who had an unusually low IQ, Anderson was at least relatively intelligent and graduated from college with a 4-year degree. And unlike Hall, a loner who often traveled, he married and even had children. However, despite those seemingly normal aspects of Anderson's life, he was still a highly dysfunctional human being. He was a habitual liar, had an enormous anger problem, mistreated other people as well as animals, was frequently fired from jobs that he held, and was obsessed with becoming a police officer, a goal he would never achieve, fortunately.
Scary to think what would have happened had he.
Right, the closest he came was when, for a 1-year period, he was hired as a jail guard.
That's still way too close.
I agree, that's not comforting either, that he wasn't allowed to have a gun. And after that 1-year period, he was let go, but that was the closest he came to achieving his dream. He spent more of his life working in careers like an insurance claims adjuster, for example. So, in reference to Leah's case, the most important piece of his personal background is not any of his occupations, it's the fact that he was from Belleville, Illinois. Belleville is just an hour's drive south of Somerville, where Leah's remains were found. And naturally, when a known murderer and probable serial killer lives within an hour of where an unsolved murder occurred, they're worth taking a look at. Anderson is known to have murdered a 34-year-old pregnant woman named Jolene Landman, along with her 3-year-old son, Kenneth, both of whom he killed via a combination of blunt force trauma to the back of the head and stabbing. For those crimes, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment.
That's incredibly ruthless.
It was. Some sources that described him as a sociopath or maybe a psychopath, and I have to say, I am not a doctor, but it sounds to me like they were right on. This guy was remorseless. Notably, Jolene, her son's, and her unborn child's murders don't bear much resemblance to Leah's. Neither of them were strangled, and they were killed in their own home. Their bodies were left there and not moved to a field or to anywhere else for that matter. And then there's a whole very intense side plot where Anderson attempted to frame his superiors at a job he'd been fired from for the murders as revenge for terminating his employment.
Most of the time when you hear about somebody murdering someone over losing their job, it's murdering the person that fired them, not a random stranger and trying to stage the scene to implicate the person that fired you.
Right? Not Dale Anderson. He went out and murdered an innocent woman, her toddler, and her unborn child, and tried to frame his former bosses from it. It is truly a unique crime. We won't dive into the details of that because, frankly, it could fill an episode on its own. I'll simply say his attempts to frame his former bosses failed. In any case, Anderson is also believed to be a likely perpetrator in several other murders which bore more resemblance to Leah's. Those cases involved the murders of young women, such as 19-year-old Christina Povalish, who was murdered in July of 1987, just a year after Leah's death. A mail carrier found her body abandoned in a ditch in Belleville, Illinois, which, again, is where Anderson was from and is just an hour's drive from Somerville, Illinois. Christina had disappeared while walking home alone through Belleville late at night, and had been reported as a missing person by her worried family who were convinced that she would never voluntarily abandon her infant daughter. The discovery of her body occurred 3 days later. Like Leah, Christina had been fatally strangled. Her body had been left partially unclothed. Unlike Leah, though, to the best of my knowledge at least, the killer had not posed her body, nor had he subjected it to any mutilation.
Okay.
Overall, there appear to be fewer similarities between Anderson's suspected murders and Leah's case than Hall's suspected murders and Leah's case. But for obvious reasons, both men are strong persons of interest. And while being in the Summerfield area at the time of Leah's murder is merely a possibility for Hall, who frequently traveled, it's a certainty for Anderson, who lived in the area. Anderson, for the record, is now dead, having died in prison at the age of 71 in 2023. And there are, of course, possibilities beyond Hall and Anderson. Leah's lifestyle, that is, her transience and habit of hitchhiking, was high risk. There's no shortage of people who might have taken advantage of the vulnerabilities her lifestyle presented. At the time of this recording, Leah's remains are in the possession of the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Department. After her remains were exhumed and analyzed there, they were not returned to her home state of California or to Summerfield, Illinois, where she'd been buried and eventually exhumed from. And this was not because the University of Tennessee needed to hold on to them for investigative reasons. Rather, it was because Leah's adoptive mom, who was her next of kin, decided to donate her remains to the University of Tennessee's Forensic Anthropology Department for research purposes. Leah's remains were allowed to decompose outdoors on the grounds of the body farm, and after full skeletonization, were placed in a box, cataloged, and put into storage with hundreds of others. This upset the people of Summerfield, who felt a sense of closeness with and duty to the woman who'd lain in their cemetery as a Jane Doe for decades. They wanted her to be returned and reburied where she could remain a part of their community if she wasn't wanted at home, but it wasn't their decision to make.
I can understand that sentiment, though.
For sure.
Especially from the investigative standpoint.
Yeah, I get it. But Leah's adoptive mom hoped that donating her remains to science would somehow help other families receive answers in the future. And so, for years, her bones have sat in a box in Knoxville and will remain there indefinitely. Although Illinois investigators have worked hard on Leah's case over the decades, they're also receiving some help from federal law enforcement. Recently, the FBI published a VICAP alert on Leah's case stating that they're seeking information on her unsolved homicide. Actually, that's how I found out about this case. I received the alert in my work inbox. It caught my attention instantly, in part because it was so strikingly similar to a case we'd recently covered, the unsolved homicide of Wilma Neeson. Like Leah, Wilma was a young woman from California who'd had a difficult adolescence and whose adult life had been characterized by transience. She'd even given birth to a baby girl who she'd placed for adoption at a young age. Also, like Leah, Wilma was murdered and her body abandoned in a rural Midwestern area. As with Leah, her case remains unsolved despite the diligent efforts of investigators. To the best of my knowledge, Leah and Wilma's cases aren't related, but I hope that if you're listening and you found Leah's story to be of special interest, that you'll also listen to our episode on Wilma's unsolved murder. Her case, too, is in need of tips so that answers and justice can finally be found. We aired our episode on Wilma's case in February of 2025. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like. And if you have any information on the murder of Eulalia Chavez, aka Leah or Lolly Chavez, please contact the St. Clair County Sheriff's Office at 618-825-5309. Or if you prefer email investigator Ben Weiss at benjamin.weiss, that's V-I-S-E, at co.st-clair.il.us.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to the sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like Leah's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We really do appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Dope Project. Last Seen Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.